Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear viewers, we're continuing with another episode of Sirat al-Mustaqim, the straight path. And in this episode, I'd like to focus more on some aspects of my own family. But before I do that, I'd like to point out that when I used to come back to the UK on vacation, I used to spend a month, and I would drive around and see my family, stay with them maybe 1 or 2 days, in some cases 3 days, and then move on to another member of the family and go up and down the country like that. Now, my wife also suffered from hay fever, so one of the best things I could do was to get her above the tree line in Scotland where there was no pollen, and that was something that we used to do in the summer. But I couldn't come out certain times of the year. The university wouldn't let me come out during the summer vacation because a lot of the senior personnel weren't present in the university, and I had to take the responsibility for the computer services. And one time I was out during registration and the computer broke down, and it was down for 3 days, and when I got back I was told, you're not going out when we have registration again. So that was another time that I couldn't go. And now what it really came down to, that the quietest time for the academic year was Ramadan. So you can go out during Ramadan and Ramadan in a non-Muslim country is not that good. Okay, so this was one of the problems. But imagine when I come to my family after being away for a year, and you turn up and say hello, they say come on in, you go on in and you sit down. What will you have for refreshment? Oh well, I'm actually fasting. So what does that mean? Well, I can eat about 10 o'clock. We'll be in bed by then, you know, so it didn't go down too well, I'm afraid. And one of my brothers said to me eventually, he said, Daud, look, he said, it's nice to see you, but can you pick another time than Ramadan to come? But it wasn't always possible, okay, and that's what I'm trying to explain first. Now, let me come to the crux of what I'm getting at. My mother died in 1991. She was 90 years old, okay? And she was the focal point for the family. Everyone would go to her, basically. And of course, she held the family together. This was the way it was. I said my father had died in 1948 or thereabouts. So, when she died, there was not the same interest in coming back to the UK for vacations, and so I actually started to spend some abroad. And in 1992 my eldest brother wrote to me. I'd been a Muslim 18 years, and the last 15 of those or so, or 14 of those, I'd spent in Saudi Arabia and only coming back for short periods of time. But what he wrote was, don't visit, don't write, don't phone. We have nothing more in common, and we don't want anything more to do with you. Okay? Now this was a bit of a blow and a bit of a surprise, because when I spoke about family relationships earlier, I mentioned that he and I were very close, that we used to go fishing together, we used to go to athletics meetings together, and so on and so forth. And even we'd just go out for a drive in the evening. Okay? So this was a bit of a surprise and a bit of a shock, and it was kind of hard to take, but if that's what he wanted, okay. So I left it at that, and I didn't do any more. And when I came back to the UK, I was talking in public, talking on Islam to communities, and someone questioned me and said, in Islam you can't break family relationships, so what do you do about building a relationship with your brother? And I said, I'm waiting for an opportunity. Okay. He said, but how will you know when it comes? I said, Allah will show me. Okay. Now, I'd kept in touch with my younger sister, as I said, and she told me that the eldest brother had had actually a heart attack, and I sent him a get well card, which I didn't write anything on it, and I printed his address on the envelope so he wouldn't recognize my handwriting, and I sent it to him. And when he got it, he apparently phoned my sister up and said, who do we know in Leicestershire? And she said, it must be Daud. So he wrote back to me thanking me for the get well card. Since he'd put his address on the top of the letter, I wrote back to him and I said, since you put your address on top of the letter, are you now willing to receive communications from me? And he wrote back and he said yes. So we started to correspond, a letter a month from each of us basically. And then he had another heart attack. There was a stent put in, and I heard this from the sister. And I wrote back to him and I mentioned it, and I said I would have telephoned you, but ... And he wrote back and he said, if you had telephoned, I would have answered the telephone and spoken to you. Okay, so we've now gone from writing to actually verbal communication, if you like. But I had one query which I couldn't really put to him, and that was, okay, so you would have spoken to me on the telephone, but what if your wife had picked it up? Okay, but I couldn't really ask him that, so that never arose. So then we actually started to telephone one another once a month, okay? And then he had a serious illness and he died. And now I was telephoning the sister-in-law, his wife, and she was telephoning me. And she was quite grief-stricken because they were very close together too, like my wife and myself, and they used to do everything together. The son had left home at the age of about 20, and they were married for 48 years. So, and they did everything together as well. So you can imagine that there was a big loss in her life. And she used to phone me once a week, and I would phone her once a week. So we were actually talking twice a week. So the communication now has gone up and up and up. But now we came to exchanging grief. I tried to console her, but her understanding of grief was not the same as mine. We think that the deceased person has gone to a better place, and inshallah they're much better off than they were in this life. And if they suffered a bit before they left this life, then their sins are being forgiven. And this is all part of the purification process, and it will be less harsh on them in the next life. So this is the Islamic way that we look at it. And when my wife died only about 3 weeks ago, this came home to roost, because you could see the difference in the way she reacted to grief and the way I reacted to grief. Yes, of course I'm upset. Yes, of course I'm very disturbed, okay? But it is the will of Allah when it comes to it. And whatever happened, or whatever we tried not to let happen, okay, in terms of nursing inconsistencies, to say the least, it all comes down to it. But this is what Allah wanted. He wanted to take her, and when He took her, whenever He wanted, and we couldn't do anything about it. So we accept that. But some other people, when they see the grief, they don't accept that that's what happened. They don't accept that the person should have been taken from them. Why did it happen? Okay, we don't question why it happened. It happened, and it was God's will that it happened. Okay. So I see the difference in the way people react to the grief, and how the religion in Islam actually supports a person when they die and the people left behind. And not every other religion seems to do that. So that was a little bit of an eye-opener, and it's very topical at the moment, and certainly in my own life. And now I've been talking to her, and I've been to see her, and you know, we're actually very close. And that may be quite a good thing, but she's actually not quite as religious as she was, whatever that means, and I'm probably more religious than I was because of what has happened. So there is this type of situation that's come out of it, and in that sense I can see the differences in how these things have happened. About a year ago, my wife's sister died, the one that she was close to, and this was a big blow to my wife. And I think that this is one of the problems in terms of her own health history, because I think that that was a turning point for making things worse for her. But again, all these things we put down to this was the will of Allah, and we accept it. Okay, there's no question of not accepting it. So I think with this I'll come to the end of this particular part, and we'll have a short break, and inshallah when we come back we'll talk some more. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear viewers, we're continuing with the part of this episode, and I now want to talk a little bit about more detail on Ramadan in the UK and perhaps somewhere else. We'll see how we go. When I used to come back for vacation, and it was during Ramadan time, the first thing, of course, is that it's pointless going to my own family, because if you turn up and you can't have any refreshments with them, you really can't do very much with them, and they feel that it's an insult to them if you can't eat with them, sort of thing. And if you're going to get up and have breakfast, for instance, while they're still sleeping, you're going to wake them up and make a bit of noise. The houses in the UK are not particularly quiet in terms of cooking and flushing toilets, banging pots and the like. So that's just a disturbing factor. And then you say to them, well, I can't eat until you've gone to bed, sort of thing. That's another problem for them. So I thought it better not to go to my family, but to go to Muslim family, my wife's sister's family in general. And that's what we would do. And that was easier. But then they're up in Scotland, and at one time, depending on the time of the year, the fasting is quite long. It would go up until about 10 or even after, before we could break fast. And then we would actually start fasting from about 1:30 in the morning. So you've only got from about 10 o'clock to 1:30, and you want to pray Maghrib, Isha and Fajr, and you also want to eat a meal after fasting all day, and you want to eat another meal before you fast all day. So there's an awful lot to cram into that. And then if you go for Taraweeh as well, you've got an awful lot crammed into 3.5 hours. But alhamdulillah, you can do it. But and since I'm on vacation, what do you do for the rest of the day, you know? So it's not that comfortable. It's much more comfortable in a Middle Eastern country, I think, in terms of fasting. And I used to really like fasting in Saudi Arabia, because the days aren't too long, the hours are shorter in terms of working, and although you can say the heat is bad, you're not really that bad, because you can pick when you go out, and you're moving in an air bubble which you take around with you, which is in the car or wherever it is, so you've got air conditioning more or less everywhere you go. It's only when you get out the car and walk to the office that you've got that little area to go where you're exposed to the sun. So that's not too difficult at all, alhamdulillah. So I prefer the Middle East for fasting and the shorter hours. But when I was first in Saudi, people used to say to me, Daud, if you find yourself getting dehydrated, you should do wuzu. So I thought, that's a good idea, so I started to do wuzu. But when I wanted to rinse my mouth out, I wanted to make sure that I didn't take any water down. And so I would put out more than I put in. And in the end, I'd have a dry mouth. But it was pleasant from my arms and my feet and my face, okay, but not from my mouth. So I tended to stop doing that, to be honest. But anyway, that was just another example of how do you cope with the heat, and how do you look after yourself when you're fasting. And of course, you take precautions. And when I went to Denmark once, when I was Ramadan was just about to start, and I saw a couple of guys in the airport that were obviously Muslims. So I went up to them and I said, Assalamu alaikum. I said, I'm just passing through, but I'm here for the night. Can you tell me if Ramadan has started? They said, yes, it has. I said, okay. And what are the hours of fasting? Oh, 8 till 6. I thought that was a bit surprising for a country so far north. I said, how do you work that out? Oh, this is a local fatwa that we're fasting these hours. Well, the funny thing was that 6 o'clock was hardly Asr, let alone in Maghrib. So I had a little bit of a problem adjusting to that, I'm afraid. But I was only there one day, so it didn't make too much difference, alhamdulillah. But I was glad when I got back to the UK and followed the routine there. But it shows that people have ideas, maybe of their own, and these are not really conforming to the strict Islamic process. But never mind, that's what they were doing. And I used to like Ramadan, and in Saudi you used to get 5 days before and 5 days after, basically. So you got a 10-day break for the Eid. And as soon as we could, we would go to Mecca or in later on Jeddah, where the family was, and we'd spend Ramadan with the children of my wife's brother and the family. And this was convenient, to say the least, but of course Ramadan is a crowded time in Mecca. But alhamdulillah, if you've got family there, it's easier, and you can pick the time that you actually go to the Haram Sharif, and so you can get there when it's not quite so busy perhaps. And you've also got a place to go back to without having to struggle too much. And if you've got a local guide, effectively, then you can move around a bit easier. So, you know, alhamdulillah, it was quite good. And we used to enjoy that. And of course the kids used to love us coming too. And after the Eid, then of course they could do what they like really, and we could go out to the beach or wherever we go to, or Jeddah, whatever. And one of the things that they always liked to do was to go to Hira and walk around and see these places. And we would go around some of the sites as well if it wasn't too crowded, you know. Because the brother-in-law had been in Mecca for some time, he'd got to know where some of the sites were, so we could go with him and see various places, like the birthplace of Muhammad ﷺ, and the cave that they hid in when they were doing the migration to Medina, things like this. So we went round to these places and we could see them, alhamdulillah. So we're a bit fortunate in a way that you have a family staying there and then you can go and stay with them. Another time when they'd moved to Jeddah, and they, in fact, my brother had died, we had some Saudi friends, and they'd bought a house for the family in Arafat, on the outskirts of Arafat, and so we used to stay there, and the family members used to collect, and they'd bring maids with them. We'd take our maid with us, and they'd all get together, and we'd spend Ramadan together like that. And that again was a very interesting time. And these were with the Saudis, and they had relatives. We'd go to the family area in the Haram Sharif, or just outside the Haram Sharif, and all be together, which was good. And then come back and we'd do whatever we wanted to do, whether we prayed Taraweeh here or there or whatever. But we were having a great time. And one year we decided that we wouldn't go. And then we got a phone call from these friends, and they said, look, we're going this afternoon in about 2 hours. Are you coming? So we said, okay. So we drove, and we got outside the Riyadh, and then just got down from the escarpment, as a matter of fact, and then it was time to break fast. So we went out to break fast, and the sand blew. The shamal came. We got between like tents, you know, and tried to protect ourselves, but it was no good. You couldn't do it. In the end, we had to pack up and get in the car and eat what we could to break the fast in the car. But that was another experience, because that's the first time I've really been in the shamal. I've driven through sand and blowing sand, but not actually been out in it. So that's quite an experience too. So, you know, all these sort of things coming along, you learn to understand various things and why life is like it is. Another time we were driving to Medina, and just before we got to Medina there was a plague of locusts. And you're driving through all these locusts, and it's like driving through a snowstorm. There's so many of them, and they're just smashing themselves against the car and also being run over. There's so many of them in the road. And that again was another experience. It's the first time I've seen it like that. I'd seen the desert locusts coming into the university campus, but these were nothing in the numbers like we were going through this swarm of them. It was tremendous. And you know, it's only when you see it that you really appreciate it, because you can talk about it, but you can't get across to people how dense it is or how thick it is, and that there's just so many of them. You just keep driving and driving and driving, and eventually you get through them, of course, but it takes a long time. So anyway, these were the sort of experiences that we had, and they're experiences which are memorable in many cases and bring back almost vivid memories of Saudi Arabia, alhamdulillah, because that's good. That was the best time of my life in Saudi Arabia. So with this we come to the end of this episode, and inshallah we will meet again. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.